Today we're going to take a look at 1 Nephi chapter 7, which essentially is the third of the Lord's commandments to Lehi, which is to find women for his sons to marry. This begins then in 7:1, where the Lord gives his third command. The first was in 1-4, to leave Jerusalem, to flee the city to save their lives. The second, in 3:2-4, is the command to get the plates so that they will have the law and can keep the covenants with the Lord. The third, then, is in 7:1, to get wives from the daughters of Ishmael, that they might raise up seed unto the Lord in the land of promise. That is, that they can have a posterity. Obviously, Lehi had only sons, or perhaps a daughter or two, but nonetheless, they needed wives for the sons, for the colony to survive. So that was the command, and they are to return to the land of Jerusalem. It says land of Jerusalem specifically, for Ishmael. Now, it appears that Ishmael is already known to Lehi's family. He just pops out of nowhere, so they seem to have some former relationship with him. It's also reported that Ishmael was of the tribe of Ephraim. It's a late report that Joseph Smith said this, and he said it was from the contents of the book of Lehi, the lost 116 pages. You can read a little bit more about this in Gardner's commentary, Second Witness, in the reference given there. So that might be a little fragment of what was in the lost book of Lehi. Anyway, Nephi goes up there. The whole family pops up, all the sons, and they essentially approach Ishmael and say, they tell him the words of the Lord, which are Lehi's prophecies and commands. They tell Ishmael this. This appears to be that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and if Ishmael waits and stays, he will be destroyed too. But the second is that the Lord himself gave a mandate for the Ishmael's family to marry Lehi's family. That's in 7:1 there. So Ishmael accepts these prophecies. His heart is softened. He believes the prophecies, and he agrees to return with his whole family, go down to Lehi in Lehi's tent. Now we have a little bit of, we can fill in a little bit of social background on this from our knowledge of the customs of the day. First of all, it was the custom to arrange marriages. That is to say, the fathers negotiated together, and the marriage was decided by the fathers. We don't know what Ishmael's social status was, but it's possible that he was rather poor and that Lehi was richer, and so this would have been a good marriage for him in a social and economic sense. And we need to understand that in ancient marriages, romance was of minimal importance. Social and economic and legal issues were far more important. There's also the unstated problem of a dowry and a bride price. That is to say, the dowry is the money the wife brings with her to the marriage. The bride price is the money that the husband brings to his wife's family for the marriage. It's paid to the family, not to the wife. Anyway, negotiations like that probably were going on behind the scenes, although there's nothing explicit in the Book of Mormon. There's a couple articles I listed here in the bibliography which can kind of fill in some of the social background on this, so you can take a look at those articles. Again, the links are available on a PDF file of these notes on my webpage. So everybody heads out into the wilderness, and we have the same type of problem arising with the concern that they don't want to go back. They don't want to leave Jerusalem. Now, Laman and Lemuel are leading this revolt, but some of the sons of Ishmael and the daughters are also involved. So the family is splitting along ideological lines of those who want to leave Jerusalem and those who don't want to leave Jerusalem. Basically, the text also says in 7:6a that there are two sons of Ishmael rebelled along with their families, which implies they were already married and probably had kids. So that Ishmael's family might have been a little older than Nephi's or Lehi's family. Anyway, the schism essentially is along the lines of Nephi versus Laman and Lemuel, with the allies from the other from Ishmael's family also split. Now, essentially, Nephi's response is to give a sermon. The sermon is fundamentally about prophecy, but he raises four issues here. First of all, he talks about their hardness of their hearts. That is, because Laman and Lemuel have hard hearts, Nephi has to give this sermon. He has to reprimand them. He also talks about blind minds. He says Laman and Lemuel are blind in your minds, which, as I mentioned before, this probably doesn't refer to mind as we understand it. It probably translates in Hebrew blind soul, but be that as it may, in the King James Version of the Bible, the term mind does occur in the English translation of the Old Testament. It translates, generally speaking, three different Hebrew words: leb for heart, nephesh for soul, and ruach for spirit. In other words, there is no Hebrew word that translates mind. These are Hebrew words that can be translated and reflect in the English concept of mind. The reason I raise this is simply that we've got to understand that they conceptualize human psychology different than we do. And it is a matter of soul and heart rather than a matter of rational cognition, which they're talking about here. Anyway, Nephi presents three themes in his sermon. The first is that Laman and Lemuel have forgotten. And this is in opposition to the idea of remembrance, in Hebrew zakor, which is a major theme of the Book of Mormon. When it pops up more clearly and explicitly, we'll talk about it a little bit more. But right now, the first problem is that Laman and Lemuel have forgotten the things they've already seen from the Lord, which is they've seen an angel. This is when the angels came to help Nephi when he was being beaten by his brothers. The second is that they were successful in getting the records from Laban, which was viewed as miraculous. And then the third is that the promise of the power of the Lord to do whatever he wants to do, which is a theme that Nephi had raised earlier when reflecting on Moses and the Pharaoh. Now, so he's reminding his brothers, okay, look, you've had these experiences, you've felt the power of the Lord, you've got to think through this and reconsider. Now, he also says that if we are faithful, we will obtain a land of promise. This is essentially reflecting back on Nephi's covenant in 2:20, where the Lord says, if you're faithful in keeping the commandments, you'll obtain a land of promise. So he's promising them again a new land, and then he makes a series of prophecies. The first is that Jerusalem will be destroyed, and again, Laman and Lemuel aren't fully convinced of this. He says the Spirit will soon cease to strive with the Jews in 7:14. This is reflected in Ezekiel 10-11, which describes the departure of the glory, the kabod of the Lord from the temple. This is the moment in prophetic analysis where the Spirit has ceased to strive with the Jews. The kabod is gone. The reason for this is that they've rejected the prophets. They've cast Jeremiah into prison. They tried to kill Lehi. And so there's this crisis brewing in Jerusalem. And Nephi's idea is that if you return to Jerusalem, you're going to be destroyed with Jerusalem. But in 7:15, he says, he essentially says, you're free to do what you want. He says, if you have choice, which I interpret to mean if you so choose to go up to the land of Jerusalem, you're going to be destroyed. And remember my words, when the destruction comes upon you, you'll remember what I'm telling you here. So the real issue is, do they believe these prophecies? They've seen some manifestations of the Lord, but they're still not convinced that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and therefore they're not convinced that they need to flee into the wilderness. That's the essence of the problem. So they're wavering, and they want to go back. Now, after this, Laman and Lemuel sees they're angry with Nephi. They always get upset when Nephi preaches to them, and that's kind of understandable because Nephi is kind of a self-righteous guy. He's always right. The Lord's always telling him what to do. He's always, does what's right, on and on and on. And you can imagine if you were Laman and Lemuel, the elder brothers of these guys, it would get on your nerves. So when he makes this sermon to them, they get angry. They tie him up and they want to leave him in the wilderness, which is another part of the Joseph of Egypt typology. But Nephi prays for strength to break his bands, and they're broken. And this parallels some Samson stories. Okay, so we're now at the situation where a crisis is brewing. Laman and Lemuel are not convinced by Nephi's words. Instead, they're going to tie him up and leave him and then go back to Jerusalem, just bag the whole thing. Before we move on to to the conclusion of chapter 17, however, we need to look at the idea of what in ancient Israelite conception is faith. Nephi talks about faith in a few verses in the first few chapters. It's not a major theme yet. It will become such in the Book of Mormon. But basically here he says you have to exercise faith in God. Now, we need to recognize that we're not talking about post-Reformation Protestant conceptualizations of what faith is. In an Israelite setting, faith means trust. If you have exercise faith in God, could be translated exercise trust in God. And to be faithful is to be loyal or trustworthy. So just bear in mind that the Israelites aren't, and Paul for that matter, don't talk about faith in the way that it's often discussed in Christian circles. They're overlapping concepts, but they're not exactly the same. And when we see some of the later Book of Mormon faith discourses, we'll talk about this idea a little bit more. So we've got a crisis now. Nephi's broken his bonds, but Laman and Lemuel are ready to beat him again. And in 719, but the daughter of Ishmael and the mother of Ishmael plead for the life of Nephi, and they soften the hearts. Now notice, this may have been the daughter of Ishmael that was pledged to Nephi for marriage, that is his fiancée. And it may have been that she was and her mother were able to convince Ishmael's sons to relent, and then that left them in a position where Laman and Lemuel had to relent. So that might be behind the scenes in this, although it's not clear. But what's probably going on, though, is a typical phenomenon where the Middle Eastern women plead with their men to attain whatever end it is, and the men more or less are honor pledged to respect their mother's wishes especially. And this is involved in ending conflicts in a number of different ways. So you've kind of got family feud here, where everybody's fighting amongst each other. There's shouting, there's waving of arms, they smack each other around a little bit, and the women move in and try to break up the fight. It's probably happened millions of times in the Middle East and other places as well. But within a Middle Eastern context, it's important to note that men can back away from a fight if the women request them to without losing honor. If men back away from a fight, they lose honor. They're viewed as cowards. But if the women request them to stop fighting, then they can stop fighting without losing honor. They're not viewed as cowards. They're viewed as noble and generous and honoring their mother and so forth. So it's an interesting reflection of this ancient Near Eastern context when you look at it from that perspective. So Laman and Lemuel ask Nephi for forgiveness. He forgives them, tells them to pray to God for forgiveness. And basically, there's a temporary truce that's going on here. It's not resolved the problems, but it is a temporary truce. Then they finally get back to Lehi's tent, and they give thanks to the Lord, and then they offer sacrifice and burnt offerings. It mentions both again, so there's two different rituals here. This is the third time they offer sacrifice, or at least the third time it's mentioned. And it's the second time they mention a burnt offering. And this burnt offering would have been a sin offering for the sin of Laman and Lemuel rebelling against and threatening to kill Nephi. So again, you have a sin, a moral crisis that needs to be mitigated by a burnt offering or a sin offering, this time probably for Laman and Lemuel. And I've put up this bibliography before, but there's a couple of good articles on this that give the context for these different sacrifices that are going on in the wilderness. That concludes chapter 7, and we'll move on to chapter 8 a little bit later.